Welcome to the Season 5 of the India Energy Hour podcast. This podcast explores the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities of India's energy transition through an in-depth discussion on policies, financial markets, social movements, and science. Your hosts for this episode are Shreya J., Delhi-based energy and climate journalist, and Dr. Sandeep Pai, Washington-based energy transition researcher and author. The show is produced by 101 Reporters, a pan-India network of grassroots reporters that produces original stories from rural India. If you like our podcast, please rate us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the platform where you listen to our podcast. Your support will help us reach a larger audience. From declarations to delivery, how climate diplomacy works. As the impacts of climate change intensify and clean energy deployment becomes crucial, energy and climate diplomacy have emerged as powerful tools to drive international cooperation and unlock finance, technology, and ambition. From global summits like COP, G7, and G20, to bilateral and multilateral partnerships, countries are negotiating entire frameworks for energy access, green industrial growth, and just transitions. But how does climate diplomacy actually work? What are the real levers for influencing outcomes in a fragmented, multipolar world? And once big declarations are made, how do we ensure follow-through and accountability on the ground? To unpack these questions, we speak with Madhura Joshi, Program Lead, Asia Hub at E3G. Madhura is an expert in international energy and climate negotiations.
Madhura, welcome to the India Energy Hour. We have been meaning to have you for a long time, and I'm also surprised why we haven't had you. So really welcome. I'm excited to talk to you about diplomacy, and it's a topic that many people want to know, but many people don't know how to do. So I think we'll learn a lot. So welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Sandeep and Shreya, for having me on the show. I've been an avid listener of your podcasts, and it's really an honor to be here. And thank you so much. Yes. And I think even folks who work on diplomacy will probably say that they still are not very sure how exactly this works, but they're plodding along nonetheless.
Right. Wonderful. Okay, so I think, I want to start with you, Madhura, as a person. Like, where are you from? What's your journey? How did you, kind of land up in the topic of diplomacy and more generally energy climate, but, over time, sort of hone in your skills on one or two specific topics, which is what everybody does. But, tell us about your story.
Interesting. So energy climate wasn't something that I initially had planned to start off with. I am a Mumbai girl. We've moved around a little bit as when I was a kid, we moved around in different parts of India. I was in Kolkata, Chennai, etc. But largely I've spent my life in Mumbai. I did my bachelor's in political science at Xavier's College. And when I was studying, I'd also taken literature, I had political science and economics, and I was equally interested in all of it. I loved languages as well. And somehow there were a few areas that emerged as really of interest to me. One was looking at, what work can you do to try and sort of understand better the social challenges. And it's much later that the political economy language and framing is something that I got to understand better over the course of my education and work. But how do you understand the social challenges and the world that you live in a little bit better? And it also got me sort of interested in, international relations, how do countries talk to each other? What happens at these venues? And of course, when you're an undergrad without knowing what multilateral institutions actually do, it does seem like really a fascinating world to inhabit. So when I was looking to do my master's, I was sort of looking at both international relations, development studies, I did my master's. Chose sort of in between international political economy and did my master's at LSE. And this was towards the sort of end of the financial crisis. I was looking at opportunities for employment after LSE. London was definitely a lot more difficult at that point of time, also for someone without any work experience. And then also, since I wanted to do more of also, understanding the world that we live in, it made sense for me to look at options in India. And for me, the entry point into international relations, international political economy, a large part of it was also like the tussle that you would have around energy, right? The wars that have happened around energy resources, et cetera, et cetera. So that's something that I was like, okay, maybe there's that some little connection. And I was fortunate to get I saw an opening, and my first job was with Gateway House. It was in Gateway House was an emerging think tank now, a really vibrant one in based in Mumbai that was looking at foreign relations. And when I was I did a small stint over there. And while working on at back then was the TAPI pipeline, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, and trying to understand, what is that? Why is this not happening? How do you sort of, how does natural gas trade happen? How do countries talk to each other? It sort of made me realize that I think I needed to not just understand the politics between different countries, but I needed to know better about the energy sectors myself to be able to talk or to be able to even, grasp then the second layer of politics that happen without knowing what your sectors itself are. It's sort of challenging. And given that when I started working almost 15 years back, you didn't have this proliferation of think tanks. The space was quite new. You basically, like in the Indian context at least, you had development folks that were, at least in Mumbai, you had the TIS folks, and then you had advertising and finance and consultancy folks, right? So there was never this whole understanding of what civil society can actually do or what think tanks actually do as well. But there was this one large piece that a lot of the policy related, governance related work typically would happen in Delhi. And that's where you build your sort of chops as well, because you're trying to influence national government policy. So that took me looking at opportunities. I got my substantive energy role, I would say, first was with the Energy and Resources Institute. I started on a project on global energy governance and understanding what that is, mapping institutions, etc. And then sort of when I realized that that space is still something that for me to make something tangible out of it, let's look at what sectoral issues are. So then I started looking at, it starts with energy security because that was the entry point into international global governance. So energy security in the domestic context, that's worked a lot more and had the opportunity to work on projects that looked at the oil and gas governance and challenges in the country, coal, renewables, nuclear. So that helped in getting the more sectoral national aspect. And sort of I went deeper and deeper to understand again the energy access part of it. So over the roles, basically, I would say that it's been like starting with without understanding what global governance, international relations is, starting with that, trying to get more sectoral understanding, working then at the state level, working on energy access issues, to now sort of coming back full circle to again start looking at with this more deeper understanding of domestic political economy context, the challenges that we have of development, growth, and of addressing climate change, to now sort of bring that up into how now diplomacy can play a role, how the countries can play a role, and actually moving things forward, creating those frameworks so that change can also happen on the ground. So that's been sort of the journey. I was with Terry, then I was with CPR, where I really honed, I think, my research skills. Then I was with Natural Resources Defense Council, leading their work on energy access, green jobs, and climate policy. And in the current role with E3G, I'm their program lead for our work on energy transitions diplomacy, clean energy transitions diplomacy for Asia, managing the work in Japan, Indonesia, and India.
Before we get into much more micro aspects of what you do and what it results into, can you just give a broad idea to our audience what energy diplomacy actually is? What does it comprise of? And if you can, share some examples or anecdotes for that matter, which would, make it easy for all of us to understand.
So I'll try with a little bit of a sort of one just background on energy diplomacy and then how energy and climate have linked with a little bit of history because researcher roots are sometimes difficult to let go of. So in very simple terms, energy diplomacy can be looked at as like the drivers for energy diplomacy is for a country trying to sort of look at strengthening its energy security, ensuring sufficiency, stability of supply, and affordability. And I mean, on the simplistic terms, in the past, it would be looked at as buyers and sellers. If you are a buyer, you want to try and build relationships with sellers that give you preferential terms if it is on a bilateral contract, or you want rules of the game as such that there is equal playing field. And if you're a seller, you want to ensure that your product, your energy, has as many buyers as possible, and you get the best possible sort of rate and returns for it. Then you have the plurilateral space, right, where it's about regional trade and establishing the rules of the game. It can be in the ASEAN context, in like Latin American context, or how European markets on energy have also evolved. And then there is the multilateral space on energy diplomacy, um, which has been also about like what are the oversight mechanisms and how do you ensure that the rules of the game are followed. But I would say that energy diplomacy, of course, traditionally has been separate completely from climate diplomacy. And the two have sort of seen a convergence, I would say, only fairly recently. But the way in which I've understood how energy diplomacy has grown from just bilateral trade to getting more countries to talk to each other has been sometimes as a response to threats or security concerns, right? So you had one of the earlier ones that sort of first oil shock of 1973 led to the formation of the International Energy Alliance and OLED with the aim of trying to lessen supply disruptions. Latin American countries felt that there's also a need for them to coordinate on action, coordinate their sort of policies. So that led to OLED being formed. Of course, before IEA was the formation of OPEC, and that happened at a time where oil prices were at a really low. So suppliers came together to say that we need to have a minimum oil sort of price for us to make benefit, for all to make benefit. So they had quotas come into place. In some sense also, how do you look at ways in which profits are maximized for everyone? So all of that sort of back and forth. So you had OPEC being formed, IEA and OLED coming off from like the buyer side as a response to the oil price fluctuations and the tensions around like oil wars and oil sort of resources, etc. And that sort of was perhaps like 20th century, I would say, was dominated by more or less your fossil fuel institutions or organizations that were looking at, trying to mitigate the tensions, ensure diversification of supplies, etc. And I would say that like it's more in the 21st century where you realize increasingly that there is a gap of organizations and platforms at the multilateral level that address climate sufficiently enough, that talk about renewables sufficiently enough. Even though you had the UNFCCC being formed in 1992, it didn't really talk about energy till almost, I would say, 2015 and then 2021, right? So essentially, we've seen now increasingly in the 21st century, more institutions being created that talk specifically about clean energy and how do you cooperate around that. Also, the linkages between climate, energy, finance coming into place, like, energy becoming a mainstay of conversations, even in platforms that were designed to talk about finance, like G20 or G7, that emerged as in response to a crisis. So I'd say that energy diplomacy has started off with more in terms of securing supplies for yourself and ensuring energy security, which has been through either diversification of sources, diversification of suppliers, or diversification or through like trade, establishing trade. And that's sort of now evolved into also understanding better the how climate energy sort of collate together. And now very closely, climate diplomacy and energy diplomacy, I would say, are now two sides of the same coin.
Interesting that you mentioned that now energy and climate diplomacy are part of the same coin, because I wanted to get this understanding. Energy diplomacy over the last decades, as you said, pinned on fossil fuels, and that's what made it sexy, if I may say so, because there's so much of geopolitics involved. There's so many uncanny countries and there are weird leaders involved in that discussions. But now with renewables coming in the game, and along with it, climate action, etc., the whole discourse has changed. You have to convince the naysayers in the first place, then you have to convince that it works, then you have to convince that gas is maybe a bridge fuel. So the whole discourse has changed. So given that you have covered the whole gamut in the last 15 years, first, how do you cope with it? Second, what is this change in dialogue that you're witnessing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you're right. I mean, energy security was sexy. That's the reason why also, there's so much of geopolitics and intrigue happening. That's what, attracted me at least to this international relations space, and then took me down the rabbit hole to get back up again. But essentially, I would say that in a sense, I feel our understanding of energy security has also changed, right? And it's changed also because of the material changes that we are seeing in our lifespan itself. And on some level, I would say that the tensions have always played out between climate and fossil interests. Like just to hark back, 1992 roughly was when you had UNFCCC, the Rio summit that led to the emergence of UNFCCC. And that time they had sort of um, acknowledged that fossil fuels is a challenge, but they're not condemned it, because you didn't also have alternate technologies at that point of time that could help in reducing the extent of reliance on fossil fuels. But since then, we've seen countries push back. Quite often, you would have the large oil producers, the OPEC and the US, and all pushing back against mentioning specifically the role of energy in creating the climate crisis itself. Actually, a lot of effort has also gone into creating that body of work at the scientific community level on the impact of human activity on climate change, and then energy, the share of energy in climate change itself. So I think that the evolution of it now is that first, there is a tacit understanding that energy security approaches now have changed. You cannot you cannot rely on fossil fuels to give you that sense of energy security. Even if you may have, like in the oil space, a more diversified a liquid sort of market, you have many more suppliers. We've also seen like the prices fluctuate massively. We are seeing basically that these are the largest contributors to your climate change. And I mean, maybe oil is a poor example to start off with, because that's probably going to get phased out the latest. But at least when you see with gas and with coal, etc., as well, that these are not necessarily the only routes for your for strengthening your energy security. And in fact, experiences have shown with geopolitical tensions, etc., that betting on clean energy might strengthen your energy security. So yes, it's sort of diversified the voices, but I think it's also made it a little bit more of an equal playing field in some sense, because no, I mean, I won't say fully equal, but it's sort of increased the number of voices that are there, because earlier with your fossil resources, the concentration was quite heavy and you had the buyers and suppliers. Here you do have now questions around renewable energy security, supply chains, etc. But once you have the installation in your backyard, the security that the country has is much higher. So I would say that Yes, it's made it more complex because it's also now about changing systems from over last 50 years, 100 years that have been built on fossils to move towards a different sort of technology. And we've seen technology transitions happen over a period of time, which has never been a smooth path. But we know that these changes need to happen both to sort of protect your physical security from climate risks perspective, but also to strengthen now from your energy security and affordability perspectives, because these are now the more competitive technologies of the future. So it's diversified voices, and you're seeing sort of the winners and losers play out quite actively on the on the negotiating spaces. Winners and losers in terms of who are the erstwhile producers, who are the erstwhile buyers, the new emerging producers of clean energy sources, as well as those who are likely to get the most affected by climate impacts if the transitions don't happen soon enough. So I think the space has become a lot. The geopolitics still exist. I think they've just gotten a lot more complicated because there are multiple challenges that are being dealt with multiple stakeholders and voices having a bigger say.
Thank you, Madhura. This is super interesting how you explain the changing landscape of obviously energy, and then, underneath or overneath the changing landscape of energy and climate diplomacy. I want to start with some 101s here. So, explain to me, like, with these changing with these changing sort of like dynamics within the diplomacy world, what are some platforms, international multilateral platforms, that one can use to leverage clean energy transitions, and how are they different? For example, G20 or COP, etc. So how are they different? What does each do?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think I will now delve a little bit, like move away a bit from the past and talk a little bit more about the present as well, because I'll clearly otherwise miss out on really landmark pieces. So I think you started with the key sort of platforms. I would say that COP and under the UNFCCC framework, COPs are one of the most dominant ones for climate and energy diplomacy. And the reason why I say it's the most dominant one is also because international commitments are both sort of an indication of political will, but also reflect sometimes real life changes. And the commitments that you make at the international level in some form or the, especially at the UN, at the UNFCCC, where you have countries bought into the COP process, these sort of then manifest in some form either as a parliament or act of parliament into domestic laws, or they get incorporated in policies, and that's how we sort of see changes happening. So to give you the more recent example, we know about the Paris Agreement that countries agreed upon in 2015 to work together to limit global temperature rise, to under 2 degrees, with efforts to keep it at 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And as a part of this, they agreed to submit nationally determined contributions. Now, because these are nationally determined contributions and they have a ambition increase or ambition ratcheting up process built into place, what countries are submitting are something that they will need to sort of show how they're progressing, and in most cases have also been translated into how it'll enact in domestic policies. um, and you also have then acts of parliament that ratify acts of parliament at the at the country level that ensure that there's progress happening on that. So I think COP remains the most critical one, but there are of course a lot now. G7 is another platform, and this is specifically uh, for monitoring the actions of G7 countries, and we've seen some sort of progress in that as well. To give a few specific examples, your G7 countries agreeing to stop funding fossil fuels internationally. They haven't made the domestic commitment yet, but that was one of the commitments that they made. They also looked at making a commitment on a predominantly decarbonized power sector for their power sectors by 2035. And more importantly, I won't say more importantly, the conversations around just energy transition partnerships is also something that emerged within the G7 context. So that's also been in the past an important one. I think how important platforms are also vary a little bit based on country politics and dynamics that end up happening at that space. In the current context, with the US pulling out, we don't know what the future of G7 could look like. G20 is also really has been very useful, though it was formed as a response to the Asian financial crisis. I would say the G20 has been more effective in bringing about coordination in financial regulations and market, whereas the energy and climate space has been more of a signaling and ambition setting space, which also has benefits, right? So I would use the example of the Indian G20. That's where we, for the first time, got the language around tripling RE, doubling energy efficiency. And there was also this huge tussle that happened between, top 20 nations on um, whether to commit on fossil fuel phase down, phase out, etc. And I think it sort of laid the groundwork towards what we saw coming up in Dubai later that year at the COP around the sort of the Dubai consensus, which had that landmark agreement of countries agreeing to transition away from fossil fuels and the recommitment of tripling RE, doubling energy efficiency by 2030. So these are definitely important platforms. But I'll just end with saying that beyond these three, I think, especially in the current context, we are also seeing energy and climate becoming a core part of, new plurilateral initiatives as well. Just the recently concluded BRICS for the first time had like a point around, had their sort of declaration around energy and climate. And this is something that's going to be a part of, your finance, of all sort of platforms, whether from a finance angle, mobilizing finance, rules for, accounting for climate risks through financial institutions, whether it's from like physical security. Even in the UN Security Council, there have been conversations around climate as a security risk, and of course around trade platforms when it comes to clean energy trade, etc., etc. So it's going to end up becoming a part of almost every conversation, and it'll be difficult to step away from climate at any point.
Yeah, it's become so embedded. So I want to clear something up top for our audience. Like, yes, these declarations happen, but it doesn't. Are they legally binding? Like one of the big wins of diplomacy, and correct me if I'm wrong, is to get the kind of declaration you were talking about, tripling of renewables, energy efficiency, or JETP deals. But then you have to do the hard work of implementation. So how does both connect? Like, just because a country goes and declares something in G20 or UNFCCC, what is at bare minimum happens when that declaration happens, and what is the best case scenario?
Yeah. So I think I would sort of differ it in different way. I would sort of split them in slightly different ways, and to the best of my understanding, the G20 declarations sometimes can, especially when they come to around energy, etc., are not binding. The language also that you see is very, very, very. We will try and do this to the best of our ability, etc., etc. And there are no monitoring mechanisms, etc., that have been put in place in the G20 when it comes to these comes to energy and climate. However, when we look at it from a COP, it's both. It's a commitment that leaders are making at an international platform. Um, they are binding to but not following them, or like in the case of the US, if they pulled out of the Paris Agreement now twice, um, there may not be penalties for not following it. And the penalties happen more in the sense, I think the impact of the penalties will differ on how big a power you are as well, how big a country you are. And the second is more loss of faith. The third is, I think, also peer pressure. Because if you have large countries that are sort of pulling out of action, either things collapse completely, or now we are seeing, a little bit more of a mobilization of other actors coming together to work. So I would say that COP declarations are more binding. That doesn't mean that they haven't failed in the past, but since the Paris Agreement, we've seen at least the architecture that is being created for monitoring at the global level. That's the reason why you have the global stock takes as well, that have a 5-year cycle that will look at the progress that countries are making against their nationally determined contributions, and what is the gap that exists between, all the sum of all parts versus what we need to limit the temperature goals? And how do you sort of then increase ambitions across the board to try and mitigate the gaps? And like I said earlier, these commitments are not just at the global level, and they don't just remain as vacuous statements. Because these are nationally determined commitments, countries need to show how they're sort of working on it, and hence they become part of policy discourse. So in the EU context, the Fit for 55 was their way of also translating their international commitments into what it means at a EU level, which then will have to be boiled down to each EU member country's targets, so that it sort of the sum of parts is equals to the whole. In the Indian context as well, I would say that our first NDCs had said that we will, look at having non-fossil fuel capacity of about 40% by 2030. And at that time, there were sort of mixed views on the direction of travel, whether it'll be easy to achieve it, not easy to achieve it, etc. But we also had domestically, just before that, huge announcement of increasing our renewables targets from 10 gigawatts to 175 gigawatts by 2022. And that was just a massive growth. And I feel that in the absence of this global move towards clean energy, nationals, governments making those commitments there, which then boil down into policies, we would not see the increase in efforts around clean energy, around sustainability measures at the rate and pace that we've seen at the moment. And now it's become a part of everything, right? You have had now financial systems, businesses that have to also report against their emissions, etc. So it may feel a lot of times that international conversations are just talk, and it is a long, painful, slow process, but they do end up materializing in our daily context. Why else do we talk about net zero if not for the commitment, or at least the announcement that was made at COP26 in 2021 by Prime Minister Modi? Net zero by 2017 in the Indian context,
Yeah.
not generally. Thanks.
Got it. Yes.
So in the same breath, if you can talk about some of the strategies that are put into force for climate and energy diplomacy, and you mentioned it, and we have been going around and around that it's a multipolar world. There are different agendas. So some of the strategies that function.
I think strategies is maybe, I won't say that I won't call what I'm going to present as strategies, but approaches that are possible. And I think that in the current context, it's one of the things that we've seen, especially post-COVID, is that you have now cascading impacts of multiple crises and multiple priorities, right? Hence, the solutions that we are now or rather negotiating spaces cannot separate a financial debt burden from like a development challenge from a climate mitigation imperative to a clean energy transition imperative. A lot of these are now sort of coalescing with each other. Second is that domestic politics all across is becoming more and more contentious. There are, again, these multiple priorities that are playing out at global level are also more urgent and acute at the national, at the local level. And people are facing climate impacts on almost a daily basis. Whether it's sort of extreme heat temperatures, unseasonal rains, floods, forest fires, pollutions, etc. So we need now increasingly first solutions that can help in addressing different multiple priorities simultaneously. Second, we also need, at the end of the day, these are political actors with a political time frame of generally 5 years, 10 years maybe, that are looking to solve a generational long-term problem and goal. So you need multilateralism as well to deliver on short-term goals while ensuring that the long-term sort of long-term goal, while like countries are on path towards long-term goal. And that is something that is tricky, because now we've gone beyond just announcements and policies to actually getting to the hard task of implementing them and implementing them at a faster pace, because the climate change is changing at a much faster pace than that, what we thought about 5 years, 10 years, or definitely in the 1990s when UNFCCC was formed, right? They kept the problem for this generation to solve. And if we don't address it now, it's going to become a huge problem later on. So I would say solutions that address multiple problems, multilateralism, delivering goals in the short term as well as with short term benefits while working towards the long term goals. The third thing I would say is that, like, I think an interesting part of the multipolarity has also been, yes, it's made negotiations have always been difficult. It's becoming all the more tricky because of multiple actors and priorities. But it's also leading to new forms of partnerships being sort of emerging, right? You don't necessarily have now, the older dominant blocks coming up in. You can't say that like in Baku, if you was to give you an example, US and China perhaps were a little bit quieter and on the back foot. You had other countries, smaller countries, playing a more active role. But I think a multipolarity also will mean that countries will now have to play an active role in agenda setting. You can't wait for someone else to set the agenda and have a more defensive part. And there will be opportunities for new alliances to form. Now, European Union and China, as a result of, on the sidelines of Baku, came out to talk about, how they will work together on climate commitments, cooperation. China willing to move away a little bit from their past positions. And this will also need like creative diplomacy to build relations outside the negotiating rooms. It's not just about COPs now, it's about throughout the year, through your multiple economic bilateral relations as well. It also means expanding perhaps the the net of actors and stakeholders that have been involved. And that's actually been useful also in moving conversations around and sometimes in sort of blocking conversations. And lastly, I would say is that I think there's a need very much to strengthen capacities of countries to engage as negotiators, especially for the developing world, because our sort of our expertise is strong, but our financial wherewithal and capacities on the ground can be quite limited compared to how prepared sometimes you have, or how the large contingents that you have from the developed world. Second is also multiplicity of actors and building capacity. It also means that civil society actors and voices need to be stronger and have that ability to hold people to account, whether it's within their country or out, international actors. And we've seen youth voices and all also play quite a big role in actually getting leaders to move by naming and shaming on the outskirts of climate diplomacy. So it is definitely a complex world. It is the hard job of actually, implementing things at a pace that's been much faster than what we've seen in the past. But yeah, there's no alternative but to try and find these creative solutions.
Yeah. I have one follow up, which, have even just being in the space and just not like you, but observing from outside, kind of, what I find is like it's more difficult for people of color from developing countries to have any say, or like you have to push the boundaries even more. I don't know if you'll agree to this, but if you do, are there examples where this has been very successful, where this is not dominant by G7? This is really like something that the global South and the leaders within global South, political leadership, but also I'm talking about civil society and others who have kind of moved the needle in some of these.
I do think that, you've had countries, global South countries, play a huge role in moving the needle. Like just the UNFCCC was in the Rio Earth Summit, right? That was the genesis of it. Our whole sustainable development goals have also come from global South country summits, etc. But you're very right that this is where the whole capacities question also comes in. And I think that links to the multipolarity of it. There's multipolarity in power and voice, but that needs to also be demonstrated then in the ability and willingness to try and set the agenda. So we are not on the back foot always. And I feel that change in the negotiating rooms is happening, but needs to happen in a bigger scale on setting agenda that helps us in addressing the climate change solutions. But again, coming back to your question, there have been spaces, coalitions that have come where you've had, I can't remember which country it was. It was a small, I think it was a small island state that told the US when it was flip flopping on the Kyoto Protocol, saying either get out of the way or join the process. And that sort of, also created that pressure on them to work on it. We In last year's negotiations, also behind the scenes, we'd heard that Colombia was really actually active in trying to be the bridge builder and the connector between different countries to get them together to agree on it. In the Paris Agreement, also, you had countries you had different sort of groupings of countries working together. India has also played role in building those bridges behind the scenes to make it happen. But the representation remains limited. And I would say the part of that reason is that uh, there are actual resource challenges in terms of how much money is available for Global South organizations. Second is access challenges. A lot of us, till the time I started actually working a lot more on the COP processes in the current role, I was not sure how these, badges got allotted. Who gets the quota of being able to go to a COP and not go to a COP, etc. And you see that now changing. Brazil this year wants to prioritize Global South participation in civil society, wants to give them higher number of badges. Because I think for a lot of the think tanks and civil societies in this space, we've been so focused on the domestic that the international is not something that we have looked at as much. We have in the limited capacities, but that has led to lesser presence in those spaces. But that hopefully will increase with more capacities being built at a time when financing is also getting tight. But this is a challenge, and it is something that is recognized that you have. It's the agenda has often been driven by the global north, and now there is a concerted effort to see what global south voices can look like, and that's why the emerging spaces around BRICS, around how the G20 presidencies also are forming their vision of energy and climate is very interesting.
Once you say get a big partnership or some big announcement happens at some of them that you listed, how do you and others work with country level partners and other stakeholders to ensure that these commitments are followed through? And if you can explain this via some examples.
So I think let me take the example of tripling RE, doubling energy efficiency. I think to get that into first the commitment itself, there is a whole bunch of work that happens before, right? I don't think. I mean, a lot of what we see in negotiating texts has been a result of multiple voices, multiple actors, multiple think tanks, scientists, etc., working behind the scenes to create that body of work and swell of momentum so that it finally gets into that one sentence into the text. But on the case of tripling RE, doubling energy efficiency, before this, sort of conversation was happening, you had in 2021 coal phase out discussion happened, right? And you had coal phase down coming into the COP text. But you quickly realize that phase down is difficult without clean energy coming online simultaneously, right? How do you phase down something if you don't have enough to supply energy, electricity, etc., to your households? So it then got into the more granular part of how do you put a number towards like a target that globally countries can look at sort of working on. You had multilateral agencies doing sort of the modeling exercises to try and look at what the global numbers can look like for that. There have been a lot of think tanks, including us, also looking at what the trajectory of pipelines on fossil fuels, on thermal power, etc., look like, how they've increased or reduced over a period of time from commitments that have been made, and what is the growth of renewables. So you created that body of work through multilateral agencies, civil society actors, business voices saying that, yes, this is possible and we need to see sort of renewables as the future direction. Countries that were championing it. So, I mean, India has a clean energy future. It was playing a really active role in looking at and pushing for ambition on tripling RE under its presidency. You also had EU stepping up for it to talk about it. So you get that into the text. Now, the next is essentially looking through, again, monitoring mechanisms. So IEA has now set up a sort of a platform, a dashboard, for the lack of a better word right now, or to see how countries are progressing against the commitments that were made in Dubai Declaration around tripling RE, doubling energy efficiency, phasing down from fossil fuels. So those reports at a global level really help. Then at the national level, you see, are your national targets ambitious enough? Where is the room for it to grow? What are the bottlenecks that are preventing perhaps this from moving? Understanding the nuances of that sector better at the national level, at the state level. How do you perhaps grow renewables? And then talking to financiers, talking to actors to look at what are the possible solutions that can help, if finance is a blocker, to attract more finance. So I think there are ways in which this can sort of be parceled in a lot of different ways, but there's a whole bunch of research that goes into it, a whole bunch of conversation with experts on understanding what are the different solutions that can be possible, talking to policymakers on seeing which of these solutions can actually be implemented as well, for that for progress to happen. And then, of course, there is the whole piece about monitoring as well, right? At the global level, to show where the laggards are, who the laggards are, who the sort of leaders are, what the challenges are. And similarly, at the national level, to understand why certain targets may not have been met and how do you sort of um, increase the pace of action if needed.
Right. I want to ask one question about the. I mean, you touched upon this throughout the last 40 minutes we talked about, but I want to understand what are the different tools that actually civil society has to influence change. So, for example, what I mean by tools is like research is a tool. So, what is the gambit of all the tools available, from campaigns to research, and are they, but the crux of my question is, are some tools more effective in certain type of countries and other tools more effective in other type of countries? I know I'm throwing you, for example, is it that certain countries are more responsive to good research and other countries care less about research, or I'm just
I think that may be a bit too, perhaps. I wouldn't say that, one works more in others. I think the level of intensity may vary a little bit, but I would say that maybe different actors respond to different kinds of messaging and different kinds of solutions. I think research is really important, but how you communicate that research is equally important, right? Um, and I completely sympathize with policymakers who are dealing with multiple different issues. You give them a 120-page report that may be very well researched and nuanced and referenced. But if you can't tell them what the key takeaways are and where they can dig in for specific details should they want, it's going to be highly difficult for a policymaker to look at 100 such researches which are 100 pages long. So the format of communication, the way of distilling the message is really important. Similarly with diplomats, a diplomat in a country is dealing with energy, it's dealing with climate, it's dealing with trade, it's dealing with your visa issues, it's dealing with immigration. They have to be experts of everything. So they don't have the time, they won't have sectoral expertise to the extent that, um, you and I may have because we work so much in this space, but they are experts in being able to, navigate the political tensions, which we may not understand, have a full understanding of. So how do you communicate to them? So research, I think, is really important, but communication is equally important, and being the ability to talk to different age groups of audience, different types of audience, to distill that research and make it useful and worthwhile, that is really helpful. And that is a huge skill. The third, I would say, is also the ability to get different types of actors together and bringing their voices and concerns. Because, I mean, we can say that there is the what is it, ivory tower work happening at different levels, right? We tell at the international level you don't understand the national context, very true. At the national level we say you don't understand the subnational context, which is also very true. And then at the subnational state level I will say that you don't, I'm an urban person, I don't necessarily have the deep understanding of what a rural challenge is. And then those sort of will differ by gender, by caste, by class. So understand those nuances are really important to be able to get to a good policy, and hence the ability to get different kinds of actors together, and you know being able to reflect and identify their challenges and reflect their challenges in the work that we do is really important. And I would say that what is a campaign? A campaign is when it's sort of trying to build everything, all of these different aspects together, using a mix of research, using a mix of multimedia comms, using a mix of different voices to communicate a message more convincingly. And in some cases, especially we've seen this in the US, legal systems have also been used very extensively to implement laws to prevent companies from or even sort of bodies from violating environmental laws, for building stronger laws, like in the context of South Africa more recently, where you had the legal system court ruling that said that building new now thermal power plants may be against the climate law itself that they've put in place. So these are just some of the tools that are there. But even within research, it's just so vast and varied. You can do the hard sciences, you can do the modeling work, you can do finance, you can look at it from a psychological perspective and behavioral change, governance. So yeah, these are some of the varied ways in which you can look at addressing the problem.
Thank you. That gives an opening to my next and last question, unless Sandeep has a follow up. You gave us a lot of career pathways there. I'm also enticed to explore that. But what is an advice that you would give, say, students or professional who want to, enter into the climate energy diplomacy space, especially in today's era?
So I would say that diplomacy is just one part of it. And I may have wanted to work on diplomacy, but didn't start off with that. It just took a longer way. So I feel that if you're interested in the climate and energy space, wherever you are, get stuck in it. And there are now so many ways of looking at it. It can be from a built environment, from a fashion perspective, from engineering, of course, quite obviously, but even like anthropologists are looking at how relationship of energy and individuals. So there are, I think, every aspect of your life now does have an energy climate space. And there is more awareness and opportunities available as well. I think diplomacy for me has become more interesting and robust because I could manage to build my knowledge base from the domestic sectors now to be able to look at the international space. But diplomacy is also happening, or international conversations are happening in all of these different sectors. Like fashion itself, there is so much of work that's happening around what does sustainable fashion look like? How do you prevent greenwashing? What does a circular economy look like? Setting standards for companies and industries. So I feel that if you're interested in the space, find whichever first route that you get to be able to get more work experience to build your knowledge, and get an understanding across different levels: the local, the rural, the urban, the local, state, national, and then sort of work your way up to diplomacy. Or you do it the other way around as well. But the routes now are varied. And I think not easier, but yeah, routes now are varied for you to choose from.
Thank you so much, Madhura. This has been a really great conversation. I always learn a lot from you. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Madhura. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Sandeep. You're very kind. I hope my ramblings were of interest and will be of interest to your listeners. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow at TIEH_podcast and get in touch with the two hosts at Shreya_J and at Sandeep Pai.